Imagine a crop with more protein than chicken, one that grows in poor soil, survives drought, tolerates neglect, and once fed entire communities without livestock. Now imagine that crop slowly disappearing, not because it failed, but because modern systems no longer needed it. Protein has always been the hardest part of survival. Calories are easy to grow, protein is not. For most of human history, meat was scarce, seasonal, and unreliable. Livestock required land, water, time, and protection. When winters were long, droughts severe, or supply chains non-existent, meat failed first. Survival depended on something else, a plant capable of delivering strength, rebuilding muscle, and sustaining labor, without animals, refrigeration, or constant care. That plant was the fava bean, also known as the broad bean, Vicia faba. Long before modern protein powders or industrial meat, fava beans were relied on as a primary source of strength. Dried fava beans contain protein levels that rival and often exceed chicken by weight. More importantly, they delivered that protein without livestock, refrigeration, or complex systems, making them one of the most dependable survival crops ever cultivated. By the end of this video, you'll understand why a crop this powerful slowly vanished from modern fields, not because it failed, but because the world around it changed. To see why, we need to look at the conditions fava beans were built for. They thrived in cold springs, poor soil, unpredictable rain, and short growing seasons. While other crops struggled, fava beans continued to grow, quietly delivering food where reliability mattered more than yield. Fava beans were uniquely suited to cold and unstable climates. Unlike many legumes, they tolerate low temperatures and can be planted very early, sometimes while frost is still present. Their roots anchor deeply, allowing them to access moisture in poor or compacted soils. This made them ideal for regions with unpredictable weather, where planting windows were short and failure carried real consequences for survival. Soil quality mattered less to fava beans than to most crops. They grew in heavy clay, rocky ground, and exhausted fields where grains often failed. As legumes, they also enriched the soil by fixing nitrogen, improving fertility for future harvests. In subsistence farming systems, this dual role was critical. Fava beans didn't just feed people, they quietly repaired the land that sustained them. Water scarcity was another challenge fava beans were built to endure. While they benefited from regular moisture, they were far less sensitive to drought than leafy vegetables or shallow-rooted crops. Their growth cycle allowed them to establish early, before summer heat intensified. This timing reduced reliance on irrigation, a major advantage in regions where rainfall was unreliable or infrastructure non-existent. Beyond survival in harsh conditions, fava beans delivered something even more valuable: dependable nutrition. When dried, they became dense stores of protein, fiber, and minerals that could be kept for months without spoilage. Stored beans were insurance against crop failure, war, or isolation. In a world without refrigeration or global trade, food that waited patiently was as important as food that grew easily. Historically, fava beans filled a role meat could not. Livestock required grazing land, winter fodder, and constant care. Animals could be lost to disease, theft, or harsh winters. Fava beans eliminated those risks. They delivered protein without movement, noise, or vulnerability. For households with limited resources, they provided strength without dependence on animals or complex systems. This reliability made fava beans central to everyday diets, not emergency rations. They appeared in stews, porridges, flatbreads, and pastes across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. They fueled agricultural labor, construction, and military campaigns. In many regions, they were openly referred to as the meat of the poor, a phrase that reflected practicality, not stigma. From a survival perspective, fava beans offered predictability. They matured within a known window, produced visible yields, and responded well to simple tools. Farmers didn't need specialized knowledge to grow them successfully. This accessibility mattered deeply in societies where knowledge was passed orally and mistakes could mean hunger. A crop that forgave errors earned trust across generations. Yet despite all these advantages, fava beans carried limitations that would later matter. They required shelling and preparation. Their flavor was earthy, not mild. Their appearance was irregular and varied by harvest. These traits never bothered subsistence farmers, but they conflicted with the priorities of modern agriculture, which values uniformity, speed, and minimal processing above resilience. As food systems industrialized, priorities shifted. Protein became centralized through livestock, soy monocultures, and processed supplements. Crops that demanded manual labor or produced uneven results were gradually sidelined. Fava beans didn't disappear overnight. They were slowly pushed out, replaced not because they failed nutritionally, but because they failed economically in an industrial model. This transition explains the mystery. Fava beans weren't forgotten due to weakness. They were abandoned because they didn't scale cleanly into modern supply chains. Machines prefer uniform pods. Markets prefer identical products. Systems prefer speed over resilience. In that environment, a crop built for survival, patience, and uncertainty simply no longer fit, even though it still worked. When compared directly to chicken, the nutritional case for fava beans becomes clear. Dried fava beans contain roughly 26 to 30% protein by weight, placing them on par with cooked chicken. They also provide complex carbohydrates, fiber, and minerals in the same food. Unlike meat, this protein required no refrigeration, no slaughter, and no daily maintenance, making it uniquely efficient in fragile systems. Protein alone, however, was not the only advantage. Fava beans delivered slow, sustained energy rather than rapid spikes. This mattered for physical labor, long days in the field, and endurance under stress. While meat provided bursts of strength, fava beans supported consistency. In survival contexts, steady output mattered more than short-term performance, especially when food access was unpredictable. Fava beans also offered nutritional diversity. Beyond protein, they supplied iron, folate, magnesium, and complex starches that supported overall health. Diets based heavily on grains often lacked balance, but fava beans helped correct that. They reduced dependency on multiple food sources by concentrating calories and nutrients into a single storable crop that could be relied upon across seasons. There were, however, real limitations. Fava beans require proper drying for long-term storage. Some people experience digestive discomfort if they are poorly prepared. In rare cases, specific genetic conditions make them unsuitable. These drawbacks were manageable in traditional systems, but became unacceptable in modern food chains that prioritize universal compatibility and minimal preparation time. Modern agriculture favors foods that move quickly from field to shelf. Chicken fits that model. It can be standardized, processed rapidly, and marketed consistently. Fava beans cannot. Their pods vary in size, harvest timing differs by climate, and preparation requires human attention. These traits made them inefficient for industrial systems, even though they remained highly efficient for survival. As diets shifted, perception followed. Protein became associated almost exclusively with meat. Plant-based protein was reframed as inferior or incomplete, despite centuries of evidence to the contrary. Fava beans were no longer seen as strength food, but as poor food. That change in perception did more damage than any agronomic limitation ever could. This shift had long-term consequences. Communities lost a crop that could tolerate climate instability, repair soil, and provide dense nutrition at low cost. Systems became more dependent on centralized production, long transport chains, and constant inputs. The removal of crops like fava beans reduced redundancy, making modern food systems faster, but also far more fragile. Today, many of the conditions that once favored fava beans are returning. Soil degradation, rising input costs, water stress, and unpredictable weather are becoming common again. In these environments, crops designed for efficiency under ideal conditions struggle. Crops designed for failure tolerance, like fava beans, begin to make sense once more. Fava beans thrive in small gardens, community plots, and marginal land. They require no specialized equipment and minimal intervention. For growers seeking food security rather than profit, these traits matter more than uniform yields. What once made fava beans obsolete in industrial systems now makes them valuable again at the local level. Understanding why fava beans disappeared reveals something larger. Modern food systems did not evolve toward resilience. They evolved toward speed, scale, and control. Crops that could not conform were discarded even if they worked. Fava beans are a reminder that survival foods are often removed, not because they fail, but because they succeed in ways markets cannot measure. Growing fava beans today requires surprisingly little. They prefer cool temperatures, tolerate light frost, and perform best when planted early in the season. Unlike many crops, they do not demand rich soil or constant watering. This makes them ideal for regions with short growing windows, degraded land, or unreliable rainfall. Their resilience reduces risk, especially for growers with limited resources. Fava beans also integrate well into low-input systems. Because they fix nitrogen, they improve soil fertility for crops planted afterward. This reduces dependence on fertilizers and supports long-term soil health. In gardens or small plots, this regenerative effect compounds over time. A single planting does more than produce food. It strengthens the system that food depends on. From a storage perspective, fava beans remain practical. Once dried properly, they can be stored for months in simple containers without refrigeration. This makes them valuable for households seeking stability rather than constant harvests. Stored beans provide insurance against failed crops, supply disruptions, or seasonal shortages, turning a single growing season into year-round nourishment. Preparation does require time and knowledge. Beans must be soaked and cooked thoroughly to improve digestibility. In traditional cultures, this knowledge was universal. In modern societies, it has been largely forgotten. This loss of preparation skills, more than any agricultural limitation, has contributed to the decline of crops like fava beans in everyday diets. Despite these requirements, the trade-off remains favorable. The energy invested in preparation is offset by reliability, nutrition, and independence. Unlike meat, fava beans do not require daily care, refrigeration, or specialized infrastructure. For individuals focused on resilience rather than convenience, these trade-offs align well with long-term food security goals. In survival scenarios, redundancy matters. Systems built around a single protein source are vulnerable. Fava beans add redundancy without complexity. They can be grown alongside grains, vegetables, and herbs, diversifying diets and reducing risk. This layered approach mirrors historical food systems that endured disruption far better than modern centralized models. Reintroducing crops like fava beans does not require rejecting modern food entirely. It requires balance. Industrial systems excel at scale, but struggle with disruption. Traditional crops excel at persistence. Combining both creates resilience. The mistake of the past was not innovation itself, but the removal of foods that functioned as safeguards when systems failed. Fava beans are not a miracle solution. They will not replace all protein needs or eliminate challenges, but they were never meant to. Their value lies in reliability, not perfection. In uncertain environments, dependable food matters more than optimized food. This distinction shaped historical diets and may need to shape future ones again. The question, then, is not whether fava beans are superior to chicken in every way. It is whether modern systems can afford to ignore foods that function outside ideal conditions. As climate instability and supply fragility increase, crops that tolerate failure regain relevance. Fava beans represent a category of food we abandoned prematurely. Understanding why fava beans disappeared helps clarify what modern food systems prioritize and what they neglect. They favor speed, uniformity, and convenience. They neglect resilience, patience, and redundancy. In choosing which crops to revive, the goal is not nostalgia. It is preparedness. Foods that survived uncertainty before may be needed again. Historically, societies that endured disruption did not rely on abundance. They relied on systems that bent without breaking. Crops like fava beans fit that logic perfectly. They produced moderate yields under poor conditions, rather than high yields under perfect ones. This distinction mattered when weather, war, or isolation disrupted normal patterns. Stability, not optimization, was the real survival advantage. Modern food systems reverse that logic. They prioritize maximum output in narrow conditions, assuming stability elsewhere. When those assumptions fail, systems struggle. Fava beans were designed for uncertainty. They accept uneven rainfall, cold starts, and delayed harvests. These traits are not flaws. They are insurance mechanisms built into the plant itself. This is why fava beans were trusted for centuries. Trust came from repetition. Year after year, they produced something edible when other crops failed. That reliability shaped planting decisions more than yield charts ever could. Farmers learned which crops tolerated mistakes. Those crops remained. Those that demanded perfection disappeared first. In modern gardens, the same logic applies. Time, water, and attention are limited. Crops that punish neglect quickly fail. Crops that tolerate neglect succeed quietly. Fava beans fall into the second category. They do not demand constant monitoring or ideal conditions. They reward basic care with dependable results, even when circumstances are imperfect. Relearning how to value these traits requires a shift in perspective. Yield per acre matters less when acreage is limited. Speed matters less when supply chains are unstable. What matters is whether a crop continues producing under stress. Fava beans answer that question clearly. They were not designed for markets. They were designed for survival. The disappearance of fava beans is not an isolated case. Many resilient crops were removed for similar reasons. They were harder to process, less uniform, and slower to monetize. In exchange, systems gained efficiency but lost flexibility. Understanding this trade-off is essential when deciding which foods deserve space in modern gardens and communities. When people ask which crops matter most if systems fail, the answer is rarely exotic. It is familiar, overlooked, and historically proven. Fava beans meet those criteria. They are not rare. They are not new. They are simply out of favor. Their strength lies in being ordinary enough to be ignored, yet dependable enough to endure. Reintroducing fava beans is not about rejecting modern diets. It is about restoring balance. Protein does not need to come from a single source. Systems become stronger when redundancy exists. Fava beans add that redundancy quietly, without demanding major lifestyle changes. Their value increases as systems become more complex and fragile. The real lesson is broader than one crop. Food security depends on diversity, patience, and tolerance for imperfection. Crops that survive neglect deserve attention in a world where attention is scarce. Fava beans represent a category of food we once understood well and then dismissed too quickly. By revisiting crops like fava beans, we recover more than nutrition. We recover strategies. We learn how earlier societies reduced risk without technology or global trade. These lessons remain relevant because the underlying problem has not changed. Survival still depends on food that works when conditions do not. Fava beans remind us that survival food is rarely glamorous. It does not arrive perfectly packaged or optimized for speed. It grows steadily, stores quietly, and waits. These traits mattered when disruption was normal, not exceptional. They mattered when people planned for failure instead of abundance. In many ways, this mindset is what modern systems lost along the way. As environmental and economic pressures increase, questions about food resilience return. Which crops tolerate poor soil? Which ones survive neglect? Which ones deliver real nutrition without complex systems? Fava beans answer all three. Their disappearance was not the result of weakness, but of priorities that favored convenience over continuity. This does not mean everyone should replace meat or restructure their entire diet. It means understanding options. Food security improves when choices expand. Crops like fava beans widen that margin of safety. They offer protein without fragility, storage without technology, and nourishment without dependence on constant external inputs. The quiet return of crops like fava beans is already happening in small gardens, community plots, and regenerative systems. These spaces value reliability over speed and function over appearance. They are not driven by markets, but by necessity. In uncertain times, these priorities begin to make sense again. Looking forward does not always require invention. Sometimes it requires recovery. The knowledge that sustained people through instability was never lost entirely. It was simply ignored. Relearning which foods endure under pressure helps rebuild systems that can adapt rather than collapse when conditions shift. If this exploration changed how you think about protein, resilience, or forgotten crops, consider which foods you would trust if systems failed. Not the fastest or the most profitable, but the ones that keep working. If you want to keep uncovering the plants and strategies that sustained people through uncertainty, subscribe and join the conversation below.